are you? Who is Eva?
I am a journalist. I started journalistically more as an activist, and I'm not ashamed to talk about that. I'm no longer an activist. I'm no longer a blogger, but that is how I started in anything political. But I didn't come from any sort of academic or political background. My parents were professional musicians, classical musicians. I grew up in an environment not political at all, musical, and frankly wasn't interested in news or politics or anything like that. Fast forward through many travels before, during, and after university, and then I started becoming interested in the world more politically. And the first issue that I was really aware of and ashamed that I didn't know about and astonished that I didn't know about was that of Palestine. And I would say that, like anybody who, I don't want to say stumbles across, but literally it is how it is. If you've grown up in the West with Western media, Western so-called education, that we aren't introduced to the issue of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine to create the state of Israel and the ongoing atrocities ever since, before 1948 and ever since. So I was not aware of that. And when in the 2000s, I became aware, this is at the end of the second uprising, the second intifada, I was, as I said, astonished, and I was trying to learn as much as I could. And eventually I decided I have to go there for myself. So that's been basically the motivation in what I've done journalistically, is always going somewhere to see for myself. And then it became, I wanted to try to give voice to the people I was meeting, realizing, even though I was still incredibly naive at that point about how media works, I understood that I wanted to somehow at least transmit their voices and their stories to people outside, so that they would have the option to at least consider a different alternative or view or opinion than that which they were presented by media, Hollywood, etc. So I, in doing so, ended up spending quite a bit of time in Palestine, both the West Bank and then in Gaza, and then, as we'll probably talk about, in Syria and elsewhere.
But on a personal level, you've also done one hell of a road trip. I mean, you went from Canada and you're now in Russia.
Yeah, that was it's pretty amusing because due to what I was reporting from Syria, I started going to Syria in 2014, when it was extremely unpopular to do so, both in terms of countering the Western NATO narrative on Syria, which was just astonishingly awful, and very, like, once you started looking at the reality on the ground in Syria, it was just so clearly blatant propaganda what NATO media was pumping out. But because I was going to Syria in those very formative years, I mean, the war in Syria started in 2011. And I can honestly and quite proudly say I never believed it was a revolution. I was talking with people whose opinions I trusted. I knew nothing about Syria. I hadn't been there. I hadn't researched it. But early on, when Western legacy media was saying there was a revolution in Syria, I early on had information that to the contrary. So I never bought into that narrative. But it wasn't until I left Gaza in 2013, and then in 2014, I was able to go to Syria. Anyway, fast forward to Russia. So basically, 2016 was a very important year in terms of the war propaganda on Syria. And I spent 4 months of that year in Syria, 2 months in the summer, 2 months in the winter, going multiple times to Aleppo, which was a key city being propagandized about. And as a consequence, at the end of that year, Aleppo was liberated. I had just left there. I'd been there for my fourth time in November. And after it was liberated, Western media said it fell. It was literally liberated from Al-Qaeda and the various terrorist factions that had occupied parts of the city. And because I was reporting what I'd seen, talking to civilians in not only Aleppo, but Western Syria, Damascus, elsewhere, they started saying, not only me, but basically anybody that was presenting a different narrative were Russian propagandists. So from then on, I was called a Russian stooge, a Russian propagandist, et cetera, et cetera. So eventually in 2019, I decided, well, I should visit, since, I've been dubbed all these things.
I mean, why not?
Why not? That's way overdue. So I visited and I loved it. I spent 2 months here in 2019. I went to the Donbass for my first time. I went to Crimea. and I saw a little bit else of the country, St. Petersburg and Moscow, and I loved it. And so then in 2020, I was still living in Canada, and I left in February thinking I was just going to be gone for a month. I planned to go to Syria. And that's actually around that time that I became aware of you during the COVID tyranny. And I ended up spending 6 months of 2020 in Syria because once I arrived, the borders closed. And so for me, it was fantastic because usually I was there on a very short visa. And I watched all the craziness unfold in the West, and I thought, okay, I'm done. Like I was done with living in Canada for quite a long time. We can talk more about that, but basically my values didn't align with at least the government of Canada's values or lack thereof. And I just felt more at home in Eastern cultures. So I debated trying to stay in Syria because I speak Arabic, so I thought that was like a kind of a given to just stay there. But in the end, I decided to come to Russia, and I'm really glad I did. So I moved here in 2021, and very happily so. Yeah.
I've interviewed a bunch of people over the years who have either been to Russia or live in Russia, and not one of them has said to me, "Oh, no, I don't like Russia. I'm not going back."
I mean, I'm aware of some of the Western propaganda and stereotypes of Russia, and I will be honest and say I haven't traveled the entire country. It is on my list to do, and I'm a pretty seasoned, simple traveler. So I think that when I finally do that road trip, I think it'll be fairly epic. But then I look forward to dismantling the lies like Russians don't have running water or all the ridiculous things that are said. But I will say this. I have traveled extensively to the Donbass, St. Petersburg, obviously, Crimea, and a handful of other places as far east that I've been has been Novosibirsk and Siberia. And the transportation is fantastic in Russia. It's incredible. And actually, even if you don't speak Russian, which I didn't my first year or so here, you can get by fine. People are quite helpful. It's a very different society than in the West, and I love it here. And yeah, I wouldn't move back to the West in ever, even if bribed.
Why do you think Western propaganda exists? Why is everything that the West is fed seems to be inverted?
You know, the late John Pilger could probably answer that far more eloquently because I'm sure you're aware of his fantastic journalism and documentary filmmaking. But both he and some of the original journalists that really just went on the ground and did what journalists should do would speak about how initially journalism was going to places, interviewing people, writing, or later on doing video reports about that. And then there arose this official narrative about what journalism should be. And that was essentially to enable this Western propaganda to take hold. So journalists like myself or Vanessa Beeley, who I know you know very well, we would be called not journalists because we didn't get our brains brainwashed in journalism school, so to speak. But those who've gone, and I'm not disparaging all who've gone through journalism school, but this is to say you could spend however long it takes to get a journalism certificate and then be awarded the title of being a journalist without having any skills or any experience. But this is to make the point that Western propaganda basically puts aside voices like yourself, like myself, like many colleagues, like journalists from the region, whether it's Palestinian or Syrian, etc., and makes it so that the only acceptable narratives until now, I think we can speak about how that's falling apart. The only acceptable narratives were those coming out of the official legacy media sites, which inevitably cited Western governments as their sources of information. And so why does that exist? Well, clearly, when they're only promoting narratives that serve NATO and that disparage against countries that are deemed as enemy states of America, then it exists to that's the reason for their existence, is to promote these narratives. So in the case of Palestine, only that which supports Israel can be promoted. And you see it all the time. I mean, in Gaza, which has been under Israeli genocide for, I think it's 20 months now, you see so many headlines, if they even deigned to mention Palestinians being slaughtered by Israel, they'll remove the person, that entity that is doing the slaughtering, and they'll just say X number of Palestinians died. And they won't say what the cause is, who the cause is. But if the situation's reversed, or if it's another area of the world, they'll be very clear, they being the Western-controlled media, to name who the perpetrator was, right? So it's absolutely astonishing. And with Gaza, it's astonishing because we've seen those paying attention, even those not paying attention, I would say can't help but have seen, if you're on social media, the horrors coming out of Gaza because of brave Palestinian journalists and citizens as well, filming their genocide and putting it online. So even with all of that coming 24/7 out of Gaza, you still have these legacy media headlines removing Israel as the perpetrator of, frankly, crimes against humanity, perpetrator of genocide, of ethnic cleansing. So back to your question, this is why Western propaganda exists, because now they weren't able to control the narrative on Gaza. They're still able to control allowing Israel to continue slaughtering and starving Palestinians, and with the aid of U.S. mercenaries in Gaza, but they can't control the narrative.
But Eva, we all know Israel is just defending itself.
Yeah. That's a trope that's been used for so long, also the anti-Semitism trope. But frankly, it just makes me blink, and I think anybody who's paying attention, because it's I can't even laugh because the tragic situation of the manifold ways in which Israel has slaughtered and tortured Palestinians, not only in Gaza, but primarily, that's where the worst of it is ongoing. And so you would have to be absolutely devoid of humanity, for one, but also removed from any sort of access to internet to truly believe that. That's the narrative they've, even, I'm sorry to go on a tangent here, but Ehud Olmert recently was shared on X, at least, I can't remember where it was originally published, saying what is happening. I'm not verbatim, I'm paraphrasing. What Netanyahu is doing in Gaza is genocide. And he said something like the deliberate starvation of civilians is unacceptable. It's a war crime. Ehud Olmert was doing the same thing when he was Prime Minister of Israel. What they dubbed Cast Lead, the 2008-2009 3-week war in Gaza. I was there at that time. And the siege on Gaza, which began under Olmert's rule, that was a siege. It is a siege of starvation. All the policies that he enacted before he was then replaced, they began with him. So he's an extreme hypocrite. I don't know. It's not that important why he's saying this, but the fact is, this has been Israeli policy for a very long time. Sorry, that was a total tangent. But so it is interesting that he came out and said, starvation of civilians is a war crime, but it's a war crime that he introduced. And this siege, which came into effect, 2006 or 7, it so brutally limited the import of life essentials that life in Gaza was virtually impossible. I remember just before I arrived reading articles about how Israel was limiting the entry or forbidding the entry of cooking gas, which is the primary means of cooking in Gaza. So Palestinians started cooking over kerosene, which is terribly toxic to cook over. So then Israel prohibited that from entering Gaza. There was reports back in 2008 and 9, and there was an Israeli journalist, Amira Haas, who broke the story I think she wrote it in 2012, but it referred to a report in 2008, which I believe was called the Red Lines document, in which the Israeli authorities calculated, based on the population in Gaza, the minimum number of calories needed to sustain people, not to enable them to flourish as life, but just to sustain them, keep them from dying. and then they transferred that amount of calories into the necessary amount of food trucks that should enter, and then they cut that down. I forget, like by a third or almost 50%. So this sadistic policy of starving Palestinians is not new, and if I may, on top of which they decimated Palestinians' ability to provide their own food, whether by fishing or by farming, by growing their own food. They systematically destroyed the wells and cisterns in the eastern and northern areas, which was the prime agricultural land in Gaza. Without water, how do you irrigate? But then even courageous Palestinians, I say courageous because they would go on their land knowing they would potentially be gunned down by Israeli soldiers. And they would still try to find ways to irrigate their land, to harvest their crops. And the Israeli soldiers, if not gunning them down, if the crops actually managed to grow, then they'd throw incendiary devices onto them and burn them. I mean, it's so sadistic. So all of these policies have been going on the sea, the fishers, whether they're on a hasaka, it's like a surfboard or a paddleboard, whatever. They'd paddle out a couple of kilometers and drop their nets and later pull the nets in. Even when they're in their swimming shorts on these surfboard-like boards, and clearly unarmed, clearly no threat to this massive Israeli gunboat, they would still be targeted by the Israeli gunboat, and they'd be fired at, they'd be abducted, or if they're in their fishing trawlers, then those would be fired at by machine gun fire, by shelling, and by heavy-duty water cannon, which might sound, well, we've seen the images from France, I think it was, or Holland. Heavy-duty water cannons are powerful. So you fire this at a fishing trawler, which can't escape this massive Israeli gunboat, and it destroys the trawler. And then, as I mentioned, the Israeli Navy would abduct Palestinians and take their boats. So basically, they decimated their ability to grow or catch food, on top of extremely limiting what food was allowed to enter Gaza. So, I mean, that is starvation policies.
You went there in 2008, if that's correct. Tell me how you got there.
Yeah, so I had spent 8 months in 2007 in the West Bank. I was ultimately deported by the Israelis and banned from coming back. They said for 10 years, but I believe it's probably a lifetime ban. And at the same time, I had been in contact with a Palestinian journalist from Rafah, southern Gaza, and was helping with some editing. And so I was because of his writing, I was also very aware of the horrific conditions in Gaza and had been trying to get there even when I was in the West Bank, but it's impossible. So after I was deported, around that time, there was a movement that had started called the Free Gaza Movement, and they were the first boat movement. And at the time, it was important because, as I recall, I don't believe Gaza was really in the news back then. I don't think most people knew what Gaza was, let alone where or the conditions there. So this boat movement, their main focus was trying to bring awareness to the siege on Gaza and to break the siege. So they sailed 5 times from Cyprus, and I was on the third boat in November 2008. Many of the people that went there, the boat I was on was a bunch of European members of parliament. And on some of the previous boats and maybe subsequent boats, there were activists like I was at the time. So that was the only way we could get to Gaza. So whereas the boats brought a token amount of humanitarian aid, that wasn't the main focus. The main focus was trying to bring political awareness to the situation. But it was a means for activists to get there. So most of the people came, stayed for a few days and left. But I went, another activist also went and stayed. And I ended up staying in total for 3 years. But the first bout was 1.5 years. Then I left through Rafah in mid-2010 and returned off and on in 2011 until 2013. So back then, though, I mentioned earlier, I was still naive enough to think, if only I could get this information into The Guardian or to BBC or CBC. I mean, that's how dumb I was, frankly. I didn't know. Because The Guardian did, at that point, have some seemingly honest articles, but now I know, of course, they only allow certain narratives, and I have no idea what the reporting is on Gaza right now because I can't stomach that. But yeah, November 2008 was when I first arrived, and about 1 month and a half after that, the Israeli 2008-9 war in Gaza began.
So tell me more about your experience there. I mean, this is something that very few people actually know anything about.
Yeah, so well, I think it's important to note that prior to December 27th, which was the date that war began, there were Israeli bombings all the time. So people seem to think, just as when the genocide began in October 2023, when Israel began bombing Gaza, which became very quickly clear that Israel was intending to commit genocide in Gaza, many people who weren't aware would think, well, Israel only bombs, as you made your comment, which I know was tongue-in-cheek or sarcastic about defending itself. Many people would think Israel's only bombing in defense in response to Hamas or other resistance firing some sort of rocket into Israel, but that's not the case. Frankly, having lived there for 3 years, there were so many times when nothing was happening and Israel would just bomb suddenly. And they would then say, oh, they bombed a terrorist, quote unquote, terrorist site. But I remember one evening, I couldn't sleep. It was hot. I was on a rooftop and saw an F-16, I think it was, and then a number of F-16s fly. It would have been east. And then I just lay there wondering, okay, what's going to happen next? And then, as I recall, they flew back. And then next thing I knew, there was a bomb like 200 meters away. So they bombed some site. This was when I was living in central Gaza in Deir al-Bala. So they bombed some site close to the sea. I have no idea what they bombed. Maybe it could have been a resistance fighter's home. I don't know. Or it could have just been an Israeli terror bombing, because those happened all the time. And so that's one thing. And I have blog entries from back then. I remember... I think I even remember his name. Saleh Okul, I think was his name. Anyway, a man in northern Gaza who was outside his home in the early evening collecting herbs for the dinner. And the Israeli army bombed outside his home, tearing him apart, depriving the family of their breadwinner. And this is before December 27th, 2008, when the war officially began. So that's one thing I think is important for people to know, is that Palestinians in Gaza were living under constant threat of Israeli bombing, and also under the sonic boom campaign, which when they create the sonic boom, it sounds like a bombing. So they were under constant state of stress. And I remember even back then, the Gaza community health, I forget their name, but a mental health group, there was Dr. Iyad Siraj, would talk back then, 2008, about how 80-90% of children had PTSD from the constant stress of Israeli bombs and sonic booms. So there's that. But even when the siege, again, I think it began after Hamas was elected in 2006. So the siege on Gaza, siege blockade, basically full enclosure of Gaza and prevention of entry of people, exit of people and goods, same. That began around 2006 or 7. And even when I arrived in 2008, it was dire. The hospitals were always reporting on a chronic deficit of essential medicines, emergency medicines. They were, because Israel had bombed the only power station in 2006 and it wasn't able to be fully repaired, we were living under constant blackouts, power outages, up to 20 hours a day when I lived there. I mean, imagine living even 12 hours a day, but then it was 14, then it was 16, then it was 20 hours a day. Imagine living like that. Just on a personal level, it becomes impossible. If you're a parent, it's impossible to keep your home clean, because the way the water functioned or didn't function there was that if there was water running, that would be based on if there was power to pump the water, and then it would be pumped up to tanks on the rooftop. And if the water wasn't pumped, you would go for days without water. So how do you clean your children? How do you clean your house? And they're very clean people. They contrary to what Israeli Hasbara would say, Palestinians are very clean. And if you can't have access to water and electricity, it makes everyday task to keep your home hygienic and sanitary, very difficult. But then you consider the impact on hospitals. So not only were they devoid of essential medicines, but also running on generators and doing the bare minimum. So meaning you'd have to triage which operations were done and which weren't. Could somebody have kidney dialysis? Could they not? And then you have, as I already spoke of, the attacks on their food sources, the fishers and the farmers, and the overwhelming reliance on food aid just to survive. And this food aid, whatever the intention, good or not, the food aid wasn't very, let's say, it wasn't like the traditional Palestinian diet, which is Mediterranean diet. So you have, as a result of people relying on carbohydrates, and without their abundant vegetables and proteins, you have a rise in malnutrition, in anemia, and stunted growth in children, in diabetes, all these food-related conditions that were, for the most part, preventable. So there's all these different layers of hell that Israel created way back then, and they only got worse. That's 2008 I'm talking about. It only got worse because the conditions didn't change. Yes, there were tunnels, and I've seen the tunnels. I went in and out of Gaza through a tunnel at one point, and I went down journalistically to see a tunnel and interview the tunnel workers. So yes, I didn't see any of the big tunnels, I have to say. I saw tunnels bringing in tomatoes, and through which people that needed medical attention abroad and couldn't exit via Rafah were coming and going, or had studies abroad in Egypt or further were coming and going. But this is the only way people were able to survive, were the goods that were brought in through the tunnels, and some of the agricultural goods that were able to be grown that weren't destroyed by the Israelis. So these are just a few elements of life in Gaza that I would think were widely unknown, and probably are still widely unknown until this current genocide.
What are the people like? Aggressive, friendly? It's mostly Muslim, but I'm guessing there were Christians too.
Yeah, there are Christians, more so in the West Bank, but there are, I believe, I think at least 2 churches. I went to one church on Christmas Eve, I think it was, in 2008. So there was a small community of Christians, and then otherwise predominantly Sunni Muslims. You would think that given their circumstances of not even from the siege onwards, but decades of having been expelled from their homes. Most of I think it's 2/3 of the residents in Gaza are refugees from Greater Palestine. So they weren't even native inhabitants, most of them, of Gaza, but this is where they ended up after Israel carved out its existence on the villages and blood of Palestinians. You would expect, just based on all of the horrible circumstances they've endured, you would expect them to be aggressive and hateful. But I honestly can say, in my time there, I found them to be, and I'm very, very well-traveled, some of the most loving people I've ever met. And Palestinians in general, Arab society in general, but it's especially Palestinian, also Syrian, but my experiences in Palestine are that they're so hospitable. They would literally give you, I once in Nablus commented, not knowing what would be the effect of my comment. I just commented on a wall calendar. It was a very nice, I didn't know the painting at the time, but it was a famous painting of a Palestinian elderly man, a refugee with a bag on his back, depicting their Nakba. And I just commented on it. And next thing I knew, they took it off the wall and gave it to me. And that kind of thing, it's a minor thing. Another instance from Nablus, because I was in the West Bank as an activist. So we would go to the worst places meaning where Palestinians endured the worst treatment from the Israeli army or the illegal colonists. And so in one example, after Nablus had been invaded by the Israeli army and many homes occupied, shot up, if not destroyed, as they say in Arabic, makluba, turned upside down, shot up, looted, everything, just as you can imagine, an army doing to a house, and that the inhabitants kept in one room for several days, denied the basics of life, maybe given food, but anyway, held in horrible conditions. And when I met this elderly grandmother, she was beaming and she was so happy to see me and she was trying to give me things. And it was so incongruous to me because I was thinking like, she'd just been through hell. She's older. She needed medication. She wasn't given the medication. She's been terrorized by the Israeli army, and she's treating me like the most honorable guest. And it was just, it was, I think, one of the pivotal moments that people have when they visit Palestine, that you can't, after those experiences, go back to living a normal life. Because I wasn't from a well-off family, but well, anybody compared to what Palestinians are living, we have homes, roofs over our head, we have relative safety, food, etc. And so going from that life where, as I said, I didn't have any sort of exposure to politics, or I certainly hadn't experienced anything to do with war or harsh conditions. And then I go there and it's already like, I say but I think this, again, anybody who spends time in Palestine has the same experience, really. You go there and you see the horrible conditions Palestinians are subjected to, and yet you meet these really kind and loving people and humorous and full of life. I mean, now look at Gaza. You still see people in Gaza doing things like teaching children to dance or making the best of their situation. They've got nowhere to live, and they still can make jokes and find ways to express themselves and express their humanity. And back to your question, like it's not what I expected. I expected, and if they had been hateful and said, get out of here, you're from the country that's bombing us or supporting the bombing of us, I wouldn't have held it against them, but they don't do that. And to be also clear, I'm aware of many Jews that have gone to Gaza, and they've also been met with hospitality, and they haven't been, told to get out, you're Jewish. But that is a line that probably the Israeli propagandists, well, not probably, definitely. In fact, definitely, I see trolls on X constantly saying, oh, well, if you were in Gaza, Hamas would rape you, which is absolute nonsense. We've seen from many of the Israelis that had been held hostage and that were released, we've seen them talking about how Hamas treated them with great humanity and protected them as much as possible. And I can just speak from my own experiences in Gaza. I was never treated like, let's say with disrespect. I was never approached as a woman and treated in any way other than as a sister or a daughter. And that's the way it was in my experience. And I would say many people had that experience.
When you talk about Palestine, what exactly are you talking about?
That's a hard question. I mean, there is historic Palestine, which was the land of Muslims, Christians, and Jews before the Zionist project to occupy, to establish Israel, but then to expand the Israeli project, the settler project in Palestine. So Palestine is the historic land that Palestinians were expelled from. It's well documented that they lived there, and that the Zionist narrative is that they developed a desert that was not blooming and they made it bloom. They went to a land without a people, and that's all nonsense. So for me, Palestine is all that historic land.
It's always a case of which came first, the chicken or the egg.
You have to go back in history. You can't, even if you want to start at October 7th, which would be just extremely intellectually dishonest to do so. But even if you want to, the narrative about what happened that day has been refuted greatly in terms of the loss of lives and who is behind the overwhelming death amount of Israelis that were killed. There have been many journalists that have looked into that. There have been interviews with Israelis who talked about the Israeli army themselves attacking them. And, so if you want to start from October 7th, the narratives that came out around that have been disputed, including especially the 40 beheaded babies, atrocious lie that the Israeli Hasbara attributed to Hamas. and it just flatly was not true, and it's been proven to be a lie that originated from Zionist propaganda. And unfortunately, tragically, we've seen since then endless scenes of beheaded babies and children and adults burned alive. And as I said, the manifold means in which Israel has slaughtered and tortured Palestinians. So even if you want to start from October 7th, at this point, it's not even, if you want to be dishonest and start from that point, at this point, we can see that the lies that were built around October 7th were lies, and everything Israel has done, quote, in response, is not a response. This is not a response. How could you possibly imagine everything that Israel has done, repeatedly bombing every single hospital in Gaza, ensuring that wounded people can't get medical care? Do you remember 2 months ago, perhaps, the media was aghast when it was reported that Israel had gunned down 14, I believe it was, paramedics. And initially, the Israeli propaganda said, no, these were Hamas. And then it turned out, aside from the fact that Israel has historically gunned down paramedics to ensure that they can't reach the people that need their help. And I can speak from personal experience, traveling with paramedics in their ambulances in the 2008-2009 war. But then there was footage from one of the murdered paramedics' phones, and it clearly showed, contrary to what the Israeli propagandist had said, it clearly showed marked vehicles with their lights on, approaching slowly the point where they were going to try to aid wounded Palestinians. And the Israeli version was something like unmarked vehicles speeding at them, and they fired in self-defense, which was nonsense. So that was just a couple of months ago. But everything Israel has done to Palestinians in Gaza has not been proportional to what they claim was the events of October 7th. So if you only start at October 7th, that's a wrong starting point. You go decades back to the creation of Israel, go a decade or two back before then, start looking at the different Israeli terrorist groups, I'm actually not going to remember all of them, Haganah, Urgun, and there's a third one I always blank on. They were committing acts of terrorism against the British and against the Palestinians. And you look at some of the notable massacres that occurred up to and during the creation of Israel in 1948. And so those are the points at which you need to start. And then you look at all the decades of violence against Palestinians since then. And, many people often say, well, why don't Palestinians resist nonviolently? First of all, under international law, they have the right to resist with arms. But put that aside, they did resist nonviolently. They still do resist nonviolently. They did all number of strikes. They had in the West Bank, for example, from around 2005, I think, the village of Bilain, which is near the city of Ramallah, and it's a village that lost 60% of its land to what is known as the apartheid wall, cutting through their land. And every Friday, they were demonstrating nonviolently, and they were met with extreme violence by the Israeli army. I went there about 10 times, I think it was. And I saw for myself, because I would always walk with the villagers at the front of the demonstration, and I saw how the violence began, and it was always from the Israeli side. Yeah, sure, later Palestinian youths would take slingshots and lob tiny rocks against these heavily armed Israeli soldiers that were firing live ammunition, high-velocity tear gas canister, and also rubber-coated metal bullets at the crowd. And the crowd comprised not resistance, but unarmed civilians, including children, including elderly. So, and then if you remember some years ago in Gaza, they had the Great March of Return. And this was supposed to be, it was hoping to be a movement that would bring, again, more light to the horrible conditions they were living in before October 7th, 2023. Under siege, under Israeli wars every 2 or 3 years, 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2000, I forget the next war. Every so many years, Israel waged a war in Gaza, destroying more critical infrastructure, making life all the more hellish to live in. And yet when I lived there, people demonstrated nonviolently, and they were gunned down. I have a lot of documentation of Israeli soldiers gunning down unarmed youths that were protesting the siege. And during the Great March of Return, I'd have to look because I don't remember the number of people that were maimed and killed, but it was a huge number of people. There was one notable case, a young woman who was a nurse, and she was shot in the back, I believe, by an Israeli sniper. Like there's just so many instances of disproportionate, and it's not even reaction, because they always like to say they're reacting, but the original egg was their violence against Palestinians, to your question.
You said Zionist project. Eva, does Israel have a right to exist?
Does any country have a right to exist? Sorry, but that's one of their token lines. I actually don't believe Israel has a right to exist. It was built on the blood of Palestinians. Their land was divided up by the United Nations and given to the Zionists. The original Zionists considered different locations for their Zionist project, among which was Palestine. They considered, I believe, Egypt. I believe they considered in Africa, in South America, which is very strange because later it became, well, this is our land. This is our holy land. God gave us this land. God is a real estate agent, And so they came to a land that was clearly occupied with the original inhabitants. And by the way, in 2012, I was in Lebanon, and in one of the refugee camps there, Palestinian refugee camps there, I met a Jewish Palestinian whose parents had joined resistance against the Zionists. And his parents were amongst those that were expelled from historic Palestine by the Zionists, and they were Jewish. So, and this is not uncommon. So it's not a question of Jews. It's a question of this colonial project in Palestine. And it's very well known that it was initially a British colonial project. Then it became an American project as well in the Middle East. So do you ever hear such and such country has a right to exist applied anywhere else? It's such a ridiculous phrase. But do Palestinians not have the right to exist? They've ethnically cleansed them. They're genociding them. They've not only created Israel on Palestinian land, but they're continually expanding. I mean, even when people used to talk about this two-state solution, which was absolutely ridiculous and not a just solution, if you look at a map of the West Bank and the areas that are supposed to be allotted to Palestinians, they're not. I mean, you go to the West Bank and you see to get from a village 5 minutes drive away, you have to take such a roundabout way of getting there because of all the Israeli military checkpoints. For example, there was a village named Sara, which would have been 5 minutes from Nablus, which is a key city in the north. And because the Israelis had built a checkpoint there, there's various checkpoints. There's the mechanical ones, like the very industrial-looking ones with the turnstiles, like outside of Nablus Hawara or outside of Al-Quds or Jerusalem. This one happened to be a roadblock checkpoint made of massive concrete blocks, cutting the road. So the people in this village couldn't get to Nablus in 5 minutes. They had to take the circuitous route, which meant there could have been any number of checkpoints, because also you could have a flying checkpoint, which is when two or more Israeli jeeps will close off the road. And then they can just say, this is a closed military zone, you can't proceed. And that's what they do all the time. So what if you need medical care and you can't get it in your village and you're trying to go to Nablus? Or what if you simply need to get there to work or go to university, et cetera, or go see your family? You have to go this roundabout route and maybe reach Nablus. So this is one example, but there's so many examples of how, even within the area that's supposed to be for Palestinians themselves, their movement is so restricted that people just have no idea. And there's a at least at the time it was called Highway 443 that went from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, going through the West Bank, and that was a Jewish-only highway, and that was another means of dividing Palestinians so they couldn't get from their village on the one side to the other side. So why is the question always, does Israel have the right to exist? Why isn't it, don't Palestinians have the right to exist? Particularly now we look at Gaza. Don't they have the right to exist, to have food? Don't they have the right to have medical care, clean water? Why is it now we have this fake NGO, an Israeli-American NGO, aid organization that's been recently created because Israel says, quote, Israel claims and accuses Hamas of stealing food aid, which in fact, there's a twist to that accusation, but let's just start with their solution. Their solution is not to use, and believe me, I'm no fan of the UN. I see the UN as part of the problem, but the UN does have UNRWA, which is an agency that's been working for decades in the occupied West Bank, in Gaza, providing education, healthcare, food, not the best food in my opinion, but still food aid. They're established there. They have the means of getting the food that is urgently needed and the medical supplies and water, etc., to those needed. They had distribution centers, but Israel has bombed them so many times. I don't know what exists any longer. But instead of that, Israel says, because they claim Hamas is stealing food, they will no longer send or allow UNRWA to distribute this food. They've had Gaza under full blockade for, I think it's 3 months now. So no food is being entering, maybe a trickle now and then. Their solution was to create this fake NGO that would operate under the control of the Israeli army. They would have Palestinians walk long distances to come get aid. And do you know what they did to them? They opened fire on them. This is their crowd control. There was too many people. They opened fire on them. They threw grenades at them. This has been ongoing for, maybe 2 weeks now. I'll have to check the timeline. But the twist to the story is their accusation of Hamas stealing food. There are actually gangs now. I forget the guy's name. I can get it for you after. But they've been operating under Israeli control in Gaza, looting food aid, under Israeli watch, under Israeli protection.
What is the long game? I mean, what is the ultimate conclusion here? Because, Eva, it appears to be a forever war now.
Israel's long game is to expel the Palestinians. They're just going to wipe each other out. Well, that's assuming it was equal grounds, and Palestinians would have the capability of doing so, which they don't. They don't have an army. They don't have air force. They don't have tanks. They don't have any of the military shit that Israel is using to murder them. I mean, just back to, I'm not making it about myself. I have to go back to 2008 and the years onwards. Imagine 2008-9, because that was the first war I've experienced. So imagine you're not only being bombed by F-16s, it's the drones in the sky constantly that are capable not only of surveillance, but massive bombings. The tanks, the Apaches, the warships, and then on a daily basis, the remote-controlled gun towers, the jeeps patrolling the fence, and the soldiers that get out and will shoot at farmers. And this is something I experienced because we would accompany the farmers. So, and then what do you have from the Palestinian side? You have resistance, and I respect the resistance, and I believe they have the right to resist. And I would say they are resisting heroically, but they do not have the same equipment and armaments that Israel has. There's no comparison. So wipe each other out is no. I mean, you will see updates of Palestinian resistance setting a trap in some place in Gaza and killing or maiming a certain number of Israeli soldiers. But that's no comparison to what Israel is doing to overwhelmingly the civilian population. But to answer your question about the long game, I mean, Israel's long game is occupying not only all of Palestine, but as we see in Syria, they've been occupying the Syrian Golan for decades, parts of Lebanon as well. Their long game is expansion. Egypt. Their long game is expansion, Greater Israel Project. And they're talking openly about expelling the over 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza. They've been wanting to do that for decades. They're talking about doing it now, about sending them in a humanitarian gesture to Libya, to somewhere else. I know Palestinians in Gaza are feeling desperate. those I speak with, including those who formerly said, I'll never leave. They have to kill me before they will force me from my house. After 20 months of genocide, they could be forgiven for saying, okay, I would like some safety now for my family. But to me, it's not conceivable that the majority of Palestinians will want to leave Gaza, even though we see what they're being put through. So I don't see how that so-called solution from the Israeli-American perspective can be enacted, because I think most Palestinians would resist it. And it's completely unjust. It's ethnic cleansing. But that is their intent. And then for Israel to occupy that land, and we've all heard Trump's comment about making it into what was his terminology, but basically turning it into prime real estate, which is just absolutely disgusting. And so I don't know. We hear these. We hear in the news. Now there's a rift between Trump and Netanyahu. Maybe not. Maybe it's just another distraction. Bottom line is, everything that happens, like now talk of a ceasefire, it's always just prolonging the suffering, because the bombing doesn't stop, the starvation doesn't stop. It could be stopped immediately were the orders given. So any of these talks of solution, it's always just more time for Israel to continue slaughtering and starving Palestinians.
You mentioned Trump, and you mentioned... Sorry?
Go ahead.
You mentioned Trump and the American connection. Do you think that Israel is effectively now just an agency of the US?
That's a question that is asked quite often. Who's controlling whom? I think you can argue both ways. Yes.
But I suppose the undercurrent is, why is there this strong link between the United States and Israel?
It's their base in West Asia. It's they have client states, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, but Israel is their military base. And this is an area that the U.S. does want to control. They're still occupying eastern parts of Syria. But when you listen to people talk about Israel's, the AIPAC, the Israeli lobby's control over people in Congress and the president himself, and, virtually every politician, in the U.S., there's very few. Cynthia McKinney, I don't know if you've had her on your show, but she'd be great to have on. She was former congresswoman back in, I don't remember, I'm not going to say the date because I'll get it wrong, but she was a couple of decades ago or more ago. Sorry, Cynthia. But she was one of the first, if not the first, I think, to speak out about how the Israeli lobby controlled Congress. And as I recall, she said that when she was being sworn in, they were telling her she had to take an oath of allegiance to Israel, and she refused to do so. And at that time, it was not common for people to speak out about that. But I mean, how preposterous is that? You're a U.S. Politician, congressperson, and you have to swear an oath to a foreign country? And if you don't, then you're going to be kicked out of Congress on some false pretext of anti-Semitism or some trumped-up charge. So in that regard, the amount of money that is poured in through the Israeli lobbies, AIPAC, the prime one, but various different people and groups, to control U.S. politics, from that perspective, that creates the perspective of Israel controlling the U.S. But on the other hand, as I said, the U.S., with a real word from the U.S. to Israel, it has to stop, for example, besieging Gaza. It has to allow food in. Trucks would be allowed in immediately if that word was given, but it's not given. It's just always hand-wringing, Trump is upset with Netanyahu kind of thing, to create the illusion of that something will be done, but it realistically won't. It is theater. It's absolutely, it's, theater, but these are people's lives at hand. And it just, I still can't wrap my head around it, even though I lived there and I'm aware of the atrocities Israel was capable and is capable and has been committing with the support of the US and Canada and most Western governments. But it's really hard to wrap your head around.
But Eva, a comment that always comes up in comment sections and in articles and in social settings is, but Israel is such a small country. Look at all the Islamic countries surrounding it, and why aren't they helping the poor Palestinians?
I mean, why aren't they helping? It's a legitimate question and criticism, but they're bought off by the U.S. Egypt is bought off by the U.S., and it is a shame because the Egyptian people, there's a lot of solidarity with Palestinians amongst the Egyptian people, but they're also, by and large, desperately poor. So why hasn't there been a tipping point where there's an actual uprising and, millions of Egyptians flood out of various Cairo and other cities towards Gaza? I don't know, but probably being kept in poverty for so long is a large part of it. Saudi Arabia is an extremely corrupt regime. They would never help. Instead of helping Palestinians, okay, they might send a token amount of aid back in the day, but any tangible help, only Yemen has been doing that. Only Ansarallah and the Yemeni people have been really in solidarity with Palestinians. Syria was, under Bashar al-Assad, Syria was supportive of Palestinians and the Palestinian cause and resistance. But otherwise, and Hezbollah, obviously, but in terms of the Gulf states, they're corrupt states. They're not going to help in any tangible way. They don't want to. I think any ethics. I'm not talking about the people. I can't talk about the people. I don't know. But the regimes in the Gulf states, they won't help in any way.
And we also know. I mean, this isn't even a secret now that the Israeli government was basically funding Hamas through Qatar.
It was in the original, I don't know when that ceased, but what I would like to say is there was a prior to that, Hamas existed as an Islamic charity before any Israeli involvement, and there has been progression. It's not, back in the day when there was funding, whenever that ceased, it's not, I think it's not honest to say, therefore, Hamas is an Israeli-controlled opposition. Because that takes away the agency of Palestinians and the fact that every generation produces new resistance fighters, and it's not because of Israeli funding or propaganda. It's because they've grown up under the Israeli bombs, and they also have grown up listening to the stories of their grandparents talking about their historic homes that they were expelled from, and there's many notable people. There's even, I forget the Israeli. I'll have to find that quote for you. A former Israeli politician, and he's pretty notable. I'm so sorry I'm forgetting his name, but he basically said if he'd been Palestinian, he would have been a resistance fighter. And it's just common sense, too. Like, honestly, if you're in this situation, you're going to resist. Anybody would resist. I want to go back to what you were saying a moment ago, though, about Israel being a small nation surrounded by Muslim countries. It is well known by this point, it was well known 5-8 years ago, that Israel was working with terrorists in Syria. They were helping terrorists in Syria. They were treating them in Israeli field hospitals. You even have photos of Netanyahu meeting with terrorists in an Israeli field hospital, being treated there and then funneled back into Syria to continue fighting. You have there's at some point years ago, ISIS apologized to Israel for accidentally attacking. And you have now ISIS, Al-Qaeda controlling Syria. And are they attacking Israel? No. They allow Israel attacks on their country. Do they retaliate? No. Did they prevent Israel from invading? No. And Giuliani, who goes by President Shara, he says they have a common enemy. And this is the guy was Al-Qaeda, ISIS. He's not reformed by any means. I'm sure we could talk for a very long time about the atrocities being committed under the Giuliani regime since they came to power in December last year against Syrian civilians, primarily minorities, primarily Alawites, but not only, also Sunnis, Christians, Shia, Syrian civilians in general. But this notion that Israel is surrounded by nations that want to kill it is another one of these narratives Israel has been pushing for decades to justify what it does to Palestinians and to Lebanese.
How can I follow your work?
Well, I used to have YouTube, but it's been obliterated, so I no longer have a channel. I actually, if you want to know the story behind that, it was right after I did a long thread on X talking about how when Israel says it's targeting medics because they're Hamas quote unquote terrorists, I did a long thread saying, actually, no. In 2009, I rode in their ambulances and they were only carrying civilians, maimed and murdered civilians. There were no weapons. And ambulances I was with and medics I knew came under fire. So I did this long thread and I gave examples and linked to my YouTube and blog entries. And the next day, my YouTube channel was deleted. I did try to have it reinstated, but they said no. And then I had
it's just coincidence.
I'm sure. And then I had a smaller one that I forgot about. It was like back in the day in Gaza, I'd used it and posted a few videos, a handful of videos, maybe a dozen. And so I was like, okay, I'll build this up. And the only reason I wanted to build it up to 500 was so I could use the community section and redirect people to my Odyssey, my Rumble, my Telegram, my blog. And that YouTube channel was deleted as well. So anyway, back to where people can follow me. I'm on Telegram Reality Theories, Eva K. Bartlett. I'm on X, I believe also Eva K. Bartlett. And I'm not on Facebook. I've also been removed from that platform. And my blog in Gaza, which is mainly used for republishing interviews like this or articles I've written, and my Substack, Eva Korean Bartlett.
All right, Eva Bartlett, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thanks so much for having me on.